With Shadow of the Erdtree still months away and Elden Ring having celebrated its 2-year anniversary earlier this week, I felt this was a good time to discuss what I consider to be Elden Ring's longest standing issue. Of course, I am talking about multiplayer. I, like many others, have had my desire to play Elden Ring bolstered by the release date trailer for Shadow of the Erdtree. It has encouraged me to make a new build to prepare for the new content, as well as revisit some old builds. Essentially, I am brushing up on the game to be ready for the DLC. This is a common sentiment in the community right now. Elden Ring is topping the Steam charts, multiplayer activity is high, and content on video platforms is flourishing. But why now? Why only when the game has announced new content? What was wrong with the old content? To some, I'm sure this question seems arbitrary. Of course, new content will encourage people to play. Ask any MMO developer when they see their biggest player spikes. But with the Souls series, I have always been of the mindset and habit of playing the game as often as I wish, with minimal regard to surges in activity because I felt I had plenty to do regardless of how many people might be playing at any given time. What every previous game in the series allowed me to do was make my own fun. Not to say Elden Ring doesn't allow for that, it absolutely does, but the way it implements those systems isn't ideal. At least, not for me. Dark Souls 3 is my most played Souls game by a mile. This is due in no small part to the robust and repeatable nature of its multiplayer, specifically how it implemented PvP. For the uninitiated, Dark Souls 3 was essentially an expansion on the core functions implemented in Demon Souls, Dark Souls 2, and Bloodborne. It took the main ideas of what the multiplayer was trying to accomplish and took it to a logical next step. Emblematic of this advancement is the topic of this video: Covenants. In Demon Souls, there were no covenants. You simply invaded using a key item and operated within the bounds of multiplayer interfacing. In this way, it is the most similar to the system in Elden Ring. In Dark Souls, however, covenants were introduced, allowing for different types of multiplayer interaction. You could become a dark wraith, compelled to steal the humanity of others. You could become a forest hunter, bound to protect Darkroot from trespassers. You could become a Blade of the Darkmoon, punishing the guilty for their sins. You could become a Gravelord servant, infecting other worlds with black phantoms and forcing spirits of vengeance to find you in battle. You could even follow the path of the dragon, gaining the powers of the ancient eternal dragons, now all but forgotten. Some covenants focused on cooperation. The Warriors of Sunlight glowed grossly incandescent, distinguishing themselves as beacons of hope and camaraderie. The Princess Guard allowed allyship with a god and granted access to unique healing miracles. The Way of White distinguished you as a follower of a common faith and, like the others, enabled you to find assistance more easily. One covenant, the Chaos Servants, even offered a shortcut through one of the game's least popular areas. Add to these distinctions that the covenants offered unique rewards as players climbed their respective ranks, spells and equipment that signified your membership, letting others know the values that your character held. All these added a tremendous level of role-playing value and incentive to participate. Playing with others is a fun thing in its own right, but operating within the lore of a game to work with or against others is so much more fulfilling. Now, with Dark Souls 2, covenants were reworked to fill similar roles for that game's lore. Much of the story of Dark Souls 2 is founded on being a distant descendant of the first, so the covenants were altered to match that theme, much in the ways that modern religions have their traditions altered to modernize with their practitioners. The Blades of the Darkmoon were succeeded by the Blue Sentinels. The Warriors of Sunlight became the heirs of the Sun. The Way of White was now the Way of Blue. The Path of the Dragon became the Dragon Remnants. Some covenants were new groups founded on similar mechanics. The Brotherhood of Blood was a fight club with a hardline rivalry against the Blue Sentinels. The Rat King Covenant allowed players to subtly adjust a field of battle, forcing trespassers onto an alternate version of the same ground. The Bellkeepers took on the role of Belfry Protectors, invading trespassers to prevent their advance. Another covenant, the Pilgrims of Dark, took a twist on traversing the abyss as a mechanic to explore new areas and find a secret boss. And the Covenant of Champions was a way to shirk the comforts of limited enemy respawns, a mechanic used throughout Dark Souls 2, and forgo any cooperative assistance, allowing veterans to test their mettle through mechanical limits. Bloodborne took a smaller scale approach and focused on fewer covenants. With the initial release, they included only 3. The Cainhurst Vilebloods, followers of a vampire matriarch tasked with stealing blood dregs to assist in continuing the royal line. Opposing them were the Executioners, righteous hunters on a crusade. Should 2 players of the opposing covenants meet in cooperation, they are flagged as hostile toward one another and obliged to carry out their respective missions. A third covenant, the Hunter of Hunters, had the player take on the role of a watcher, putting down any hunter who becomes addled with blood, represented in-game by a random chance to be hostile toward a cooperator. The DLC patch for Bloodborne brought an additional 3 covenants, one of which was available even to players who did not purchase the DLC. The League had players take on the role of confederates, cooperating with one another in common goal and getting a small HP boost when summoned. The other 2 covenants let the players explore elements hinted at in the base game. The Beast's Embrace allowed players to take on a beast-like form and fight as such, and the Lumenwood Kin let players transform into a celestial creature from beyond the sky. Finally, with Dark Souls 3, covenants took a focused and pragmatic approach. Drawing on the previous entries, it restored several former covenants. The Warriors of Sunlight were back in all their glowing glory, the Way of Blue and Blue Sentinels both made their way through from Dark Souls 2, and the Blades of the Dark Moon returned to hammer home the repurposing of Anor Londo. Rosaria's Fingers added a rebirth mechanic as a reward for PvP, and the Mound Makers introduced the idea of a third party, allowing players to help or harm under the assumption of madness. The DLC added the Spears of the Church, a pseudo-invasion covenant that enabled players to take on the role of a boss, much in the same way Demon Souls had with the Old Monk. But the 2 covenants that are most significant to this game's long-term multiplayer are the Trespasser covenants. The Watchdogs of Farron and the Aldrich Faithful both adjusted the dynamic of PvP in a simple but very compelling way. Instead of allowing you to summon 2 allies and leave 1 slot for an invader, the zones these covenants protected changed 1 phantom slot to an invader slot. This could be widened on each side by use of the Dried Finger item, expanding the total count to 3v3. Now, the Bellkeepers did something similar in Dark Souls 2, but the areas were entirely optional and did not have the expanded player count until Scholar of the First Sin. In addition, some of the other oddities and experimentations and the inconsistencies of multiplayer, soul memory, Dark Souls 2 never held the staying power of its sequel. But in Dark Souls 3, these covenants were exceptionally well positioned. By placing their zones in mandatory areas, players are forced together. This means higher interaction rates, which is obviously good for multiplayer. I often hear the complaint that players who don't like PvP should not be forced into it. The problem with that argument is that it goes against the spirit and mechanics of the game. To me, that argument is no different than saying if you don't want to beat a boss, you shouldn't have to, and the game should just let you progress. It defeats the purpose of how the game is built. You can argue that PvP is different, and there's no accounting for the chaos and unpredictability another player might bring into your game, but that is exactly what makes it good. Sure, it may go poorly for you, but each encounter is literally a unique experience you have never experienced before and will never experience again. No matter how similar the encounter, no 2 are identical. Its value is infinite. So what did Dark Souls 3 do to make it work so well for so many people for so long? Well, I think it comes down to a few things. 1, the connectivity was vastly improved from previous titles. Instead of hoping you could find a friend or foe and spamming search for hours, you had a password for cooperation. And by prioritizing cooperators as targets of invasions, and having dedicated invasion zones on the main progression path, it made invading a lot easier. 2, the consistent chaos of 3v3 and the player community fight clubs took everything that made invading special and amplified it. Add to that the automated system of covenants constantly seeking for invasions on behalf of players, even while they did other things, and you just get a good collaborative effort where people are constantly being pushed into conflict. And 3, Dark Souls 3 did not have a successor until Elden Ring. There was no PvP Souls game to play for 6 years. Never underestimate a lack of options. Not to say that Dark Souls 3 was perfect by any means. Common complaints of terrible netcode and latency are well founded, but none of it was enough to stifle the community. They enjoyed it, jank and all, more than ever. And then Elden Ring came along. Now, if you've watched my previous videos, you will know that I am dissatisfied with what Elden Ring has done to multiplayer. By removing covenants and boiling down the multiplayer interactions to their most basic mechanical form, they have lowered the bar for entry at the cost of the incentive to participate. With every previous title, the covenants offered you a mechanical incentive to roleplay, a major component of RPGs, or so I'm told. By removing covenants, Elden Ring has removed that aspect. Sure, you can say you're role-playing as a bloody finger, but how is that different from a recusant finger? I am not bound to one or the other, and in fact I can have both options available on any character. Neither offers a unique reward, so they struggle to hold separate identities. They are acquired from separate questlines, but they are mechanically identical. And it's the same story with the white and blue cipher rings. They take what was a unique lore choice and compress it down to the mechanic of calling the cops or being a cop. I liked being a blue sentinel or Blade of the Dark Moon. I think little of the little glowing rings. None of this is to say that Elden Ring lacks role-playing depth. only that Covenants were a special way to adjust multiplayer based around role-playing. And maybe you are of the opinion that it does not matter, that you don't care about any of that and you just want to ride around on your horse and fight big monsters. That is a perfectly valid opinion that is in no way affected by anything I'm talking about. No matter what they add in multiplayer or what they force via invasions, playing offline has always been an option and allows anyone to opt out of any such experience. Advocating for those systems to be degraded or removed doesn't really hold water for me. The point I want to get across is that Elden Ring made an error by making the systems opt-in. By allowing players to choose when they participate in multiplayer, it lowers overall interactions. By not including a forced invasion zone, there is nowhere to go where you will definitely encounter opposition. It even went as far as removing the ability to be invaded at all while playing alone. Dark Souls 3 had already adjusted priority to favor cooperators, so by removing solo targets entirely, it has cut a major portion of the player base from the potential target list, making it that much more difficult to invade. The fewer invasions means there are fewer opportunities to respond to invasions as a blue. When one link on a chain is broken, the rest falls away with it. And let's not forget about cooperation. With no covenants to encourage it, players must cooperate for cooperation's sake alone, and Elden Ring made sure that if you do want to cooperate, you are giving up a monumental amount of convenience. Let's take a brief deviation from covenants to talk about a specific issue with Elden Ring. The Lands Between is a vast area with incredible distances to cover. To assist players in this traversal, Elden Ring added Torrent, a trusty steed who can run and jump across the terrain with comparative ease. So why they chose to remove mounts in multiplayer is beyond me. The only reason I have come up with after 2 years of deliberation is that they knew how tedious exploration in the overworld was, and letting players ride around together would encourage them to cooperate in the overworld where they did not prioritize multiplayer. Games encourage the behaviors they reward. Every good developer knows this. By making it actively more tedious to play together outside of the more dense dungeons, they are encouraging multiplayer only in those areas. Sure, they allow you to cooperate outside of those dungeons and forego fast travel, both on horseback and through the menu, but you will pay for it with your time. This is something I have been focused on since starting my most recent playthrough. I and several of my friends have all made new characters to prepare for the DLC, but we only cooperate when going through the larger dungeons such as Stormvale and Raya Lucaria. This feels like a necessary measure to avoid wasting time. Because we can only play with 3 people in a session, not everyone can participate in every session, and since we are all adults with obligations outside of the game, we strive to respect each other's time. Coupled with this problem is that Elden Ring is full of chores. Many quest lines and locations and dungeons and items means that you have a lot to do per character, so it doesn't make a lot of sense to make it take much longer to do all those tasks when you can't actively do everything in a group. You are incentivized to act separately, cooperating only when it is most convenient. Consider the fact that you cannot enter dungeons from the outside while cooperating. The fog gates that bar entrances to most of the game's dungeons are a clear signal that you are not playing as intended and will not be rewarded for doing so. I think this design is best established by considering any area where you cannot use Torrent. Elden Ring tells you that if you can't use Torrent, you should slow your pace. It suggests you may encounter resistance, so bringing a friend is encouraged. But in every other area, where Torrent is available, going as quickly as possible might be the best option. They even lock out certain traversal options by not having Torrent, which to me further reinforces this notion. The problem is your decision to engage with multiplayer is one of personal expense. Can you afford to spend your time helping someone? Can you bear the cost of invading anywhere, even in the overworld where your target is free to run away forever? You are actively discouraged from choosing multiplayer, with no reward to offset it. So with that tangent in mind, let's consider the question at hand. Should Shadow of the Erdtree bring back Covenants? Would Covenants fix these issues? Well, no. At least, not all of them. But it could help to address what I find to be the major contributing factor: incentive. Elden Ring has built itself to encourage exploration at the cost of cooperation. Shadow of the Erdtree can remedy this by either making the expansion more dense, easing cooperative exploration, or by adjusting what is to be gained by engaging with multiplayer. And a forced invasion zone also just feels so right when talking about a land of shadow. Forcing players into conflict is a great way to reinforce the theme of a contended space. All that is to say, if players have to make the choice of taking a long time to do something with someone else or doing it quickly alone, the deciding factor will come down to which is most incentivized. If the DLC adds covenants, or something like them, that rewards players for foregoing the convenience of mounted travel, or encourages them to fight others to slow their progress, it could help maximize their time with the game. After all, no time is wasted while you're enjoying it. That's far from all I have to say on the topic of multiplayer, but I want to stop there for now. There are a lot of things I want to see the DLC address that I will be discussing in future videos, so if this rant was of interest to you, feel free to like and subscribe. This is a new channel and I'm a long way from monetization, so your support would mean a lot. Thank you for watching.